Imagine inheriting a $4 trillion empire. Not a fortune, an empire. With 1.5 billion devices in people's pockets. With a brand so powerful, people camp outside stores for 3 days just to be first. Now imagine inheriting all of that and being told, great, but what do you do next? Because the iPhone hasn't been reinvented in almost 2 decades. Because the car Apple spent a decade building, quietly killed. Because while Google and Microsoft were pouring hundreds of billions into AI, Apple was watching, waiting. On April 20th, 2026, Apple announced that Tim Cook, the man who turned a nearly bankrupt company into the most valuable business in human history, is stepping down. And the man who has to answer that impossible question is someone most people had never heard of. Apple has always been defined by its leaders. Steve Jobs was the visionary, the showman, the man who made you feel like a product was art. Tim Cook was the operator, the supply chain genius who turned Jobs' dreams into a profit machine worth $4 trillion. Now comes John Ternus, 51 years old, quiet, private, an engineer's engineer. He doesn't give keynotes, he doesn't do media tours, he builds things, and Apple just handed him the most complicated job on the planet. To understand why this transition matters so much, you have to understand what Tim Cook actually built. When he took over in 2011, Apple was worth around $350 billion. By the time he stepped back, it was $4 trillion. He didn't do it with flashy new products. He did it by being the greatest supply chain architect in history. He built relationships in China so deep that Apple could produce hundreds of millions of iPhones a year with terrifying precision. He turned services, iCloud, Apple Music, the App Store, into a $109 billion a year business. But here's the flaw in that perfect machine. Cook was so good at optimizing what already existed that Apple quietly stopped inventing what comes next. The Vision Pro, a $3,500 headset most people tried once and put back in the box. Apple Car, a decade of work, billions spent, and then silently abandoned. And AI, as OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft rewrote the rules of technology, Apple's strategy was essentially, let's use Google's AI model for Siri. The machine was running perfectly, it just wasn't going anywhere new. And then there's the problem that keeps Apple's board awake at night: China. For years, Apple manufactured roughly 90% of its products there. Greater China generated $71.4 billion in revenue in 2025 alone, 16% of Apple's global sales. Cook's greatest strength was his relationship with China, but that strength quietly became Apple's greatest vulnerability. Trade wars, tariffs, geopolitical tensions. Chinese authorities reportedly recalling engineers from Apple's Indian factories to slow the company's exit from China. Cook spent his final years carefully shifting some production to India, negotiating, diplomating. Now that work falls to John Ternus. Here's the problem. Ternus is a hardware engineer. His LinkedIn profile doesn't mention China once. He has never been Apple's political operator. That was Cook's job. And in a world where Apple's supply chain is a geopolitical chess match, that gap is enormous. So why choose him? Because Apple's board made a bet. They believe the next war in technology won't be fought in data centers. It'll be fought in the devices in your hand, on your face, in your home. And nobody on the planet knows how to build those devices better than John Ternus. He led Apple Silicon, the transition that made Macs faster than anything Windows could offer. He was behind AirPods, the Apple Watch, the iPad evolution, even the Vision Pro, as commercially disappointing as it was
was his engineering masterpiece. Now, Ternus is expected to push Apple in directions it's never gone. Smart glasses to compete with Meta's Ray-Bans, a foldable iPhone, finally, after years of rumors, a home robot, not science fiction. Reports suggest Apple is actively developing a tabletop device with a robotic arm that tracks you around the room. And maybe most importantly, a completely different AI strategy, not competing with ChatGPT on a server somewhere, but turning every Apple device into an on-device AI hub. Local, private, fast. He's betting that Apple's future isn't in the cloud, it's in the object you hold in your hand.
Here's what this story is really about. Apple has had 3 eras. Jobs built the dream, Cook built the empire, now Ternus has to build what comes after. And the cruel irony is this: Cook's success was so complete, the iPhone so profitable, the services so sticky, that the pressure to take real risks was always easy to defer. Why bet billions on something new when the old thing keeps printing money? Ternus doesn't have that luxury anymore. AI is rewriting how people interact with technology. Meta and Google are already selling smart glasses. Jony Ive, Apple's own legendary designer, is now building hardware for OpenAI. The window for Apple to define the next category of computing is open, but it won't stay open forever. Ternus is a safe choice in a dangerous moment, some analysts say. But maybe that's exactly what Apple needs. Someone who doesn't want to be the loudest person in the room. Someone who just wants to build something that changes everything. The question isn't whether John Ternus is good enough for Apple. The real question is, has Apple waited too long to find out? If you found this breakdown valuable, this channel exists for exactly this kind of story. The business drama, the strategy, the bets that shape the world. Hit subscribe so you never miss one.